Hey, what is going on? It is February 8th, 2022. And yes, you guessed it, we have another brain video. Okay. Now, I was having a challenging time deciding on what to focus on in this current brain video because I was, in my last video, talking about the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the sensory motor cortex, and the supplementary motor area, which are the four cortexes I originally thought I was going to focus on and descend down into the brain. Um, but the issue is that the brain is like the complexity of the brain. A lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of interconnections between different anatomical substructures. For example, the motor cortex. I talked about the cerebrospinal tract, and that kind of makes sense because the motor cortex has upper motor neurons which go through the cerebrospinal tract and also the corticotubular tract and the cerebrospinal tract both, and they go to the muscles that they innervate, and that kind of makes sense. But the motor cortex actually also it doesn't do that in isolation. It connects to the basal ganglia, which is something that you always hear about the basal ganglia, but that's one of those things that you just kind of hear about, and then you have to dig deeper to actually know about. The basal ganglia are the structures within the center of your brain, right? So, like, if you ever see the a sagittal cut of your brain, which these are sagittal cuts, you'll see usually the gray matter and myelinated matter on the outside and slightly on the inside, which is the cortical matter, right? But then you have these more unique structures in the inside of your brain, these unique gangliar structures. And I put a thalamus real image here so you can kind of see what's going on. All this stuff here in the center of the brain, which is differentiated from the wrinkly sulci and gyri that are a part of the cortical regions of the brain, where a ton of the processing, your consciousness, you really want to study consciousness, you have to go into this region here. And so it's, again, we're going to have to do a lot of dissection, but these are just collectively called the basal ganglia. And the motor cortex connects to the basal ganglia in order to regulate stimulation of motor neurons and motor planning. So there is this pathway. There are two pathways of stimulation. One is called the indirect, and the other is called a direct pathway. And so the indirect pathway, we'll start with the indirect pathway because that's just what happens to be here, is when the motor cortex actually gets inhibited from overstimulation. So that's why what happens is the motor cortex sends information or sends stimulatory signals down neurons. In this particular case, it's neurons that use glutamate as their neurotransmitter, and then it connects the striatum. Then is essentially an organ which we have to go more deeply into, but the striatum then will connect to other structures, like, for example, the globus pallidus externus, right? And then that will connect to the substantia nigra, which will then connect to the thalamus, and which will inhibit the motor cortex. So this is, you're not going to get a ton right now about what I'm saying just from talking about it here, because, again, there are so many structures involved in the basal ganglia, and the inhibition and the excitation of motion and motion planning. Like, even if you go to the Basal Ganglia wiki, right, it's basal ganglia refers to a group of subcortical nuclei responsible for primary motor control, as well as other roles as motor learning, executive functions, and behaviors and emotions. Disruption of the basal ganglia network forms the basis for several movement disorders. So essentially, it's hard to talk about the motor cortex without talking about the basal ganglia, the motor cortex being here, right? If you subdivide the brain around this region, we'll have to communicate with the basal ganglia to integrate that information and make sense of it, and then I guess send the final or resend the final motor plan. You can maybe think of it like Congress, right? You want to pass a law, you send a bill to Congress. Congress debates on the law, sends it back to the executive branch, or sends it to the Senate, and then the Senate debates on it, might send it back to Congress, and then finally it goes back to the executive branch, which then executes the law, right? So that's basically, like there's an analog in that process to what goes on in the brain in terms of execution of motor movement. And right now I'm talking very high level because I'm still learning what's going on here, but it's quite interesting. So the most important piece of this, or one of the most important pieces of this, they're all important, and I want to get to all of that at some point soon. But the one, and here's a transverse section of the brain. You see the thalamus, or these green areas here, right? They're like, all of this is like differentiated. This is just colored differently now, right? But this thalamus region here, the thalamus is kind of like what people call the gateway to the consciousness, because it is a pretty crazy involved structure. Like, if you break down the thalamus, right, you have a ton of different substructures going on, right? So this is like just I think what I heard was that there's 50 separate subnuclear regions of the thalamus, which do all sorts of things, right? Like, these are just some of the main ones, like lateral dorsal, posterior, ventral interior, ventral nucleus. And if I was a med student, I'd probably have to remember all of this stuff, which seems difficult, right? And that's the thing, like, these boundaries are really not deterministic. These are their function was determined by electrical stimulation, right, and MRI, and all sorts of like imaging techniques on the brain to kind of see what regions of the thalamus were stimulated. So there was a lot of dissection going on to get to the real function of the thalamus. But if you look at the direct versus indirect pathway and the basal ganglia again, you notice that the thalamus is always at the bottom, right? Here's actually the best graph. This is a Parkinson's disease comparison of pathways, but essentially, like, the striatum, we can use this, right? This is called the substantia nigra, SNR, globus pallidus internus, and globus pallidus externus. We're going to learn about these. This is the substantia nigra, and then this striatum. Essentially, this goes to the. Let me find a good example of this here. This thalamus, right? Indirect pathway and path. This is the perfect diagram, or sort of perfect. This thalamus then returns information to the motor cortex. Okay, so essentially, in both of these stimulatory pathways from signals coming from the motor cortex, you will have to go through either this direct or indirect pathway, and there's alternation between these because one causes movement, and if there was only a direct pathway, for instance, right, you would just have constant motion stimulation because it would never stop, because you would pretty much have excitation going to the cortex and then going back, and those are in glutamate. Glutamate excites, right? Glutamate is a neurotransmitter of excitatory neurons. The GABA is the neurotransmitter of inhibitory neurons, and GABA is involved in the indirect pathway. Neurons that use GABA is involved in the indirect pathway, which prevent the cortex from being overstimulated by the thalamus by regulating thalamic excitation. Right, so that's a lot to take in, but it's important to know, because one thing we'll have to do is we're going to have to break down all of these basal ganglia elements at some point and talk about it, though. I just wanted to give a quick overview of the basal ganglia because I'm going to have to go back to it later on after I talk more about the motor cortex, but I realize now that there's going to be a lot of jumping around. Once again, another thing to note for, if you don't remember, ganglia is a group of glia, right? So it's a gang of glial cells and neurons. So, and it's basal because it's at the basement of the brain. This whole region is on top of the brainstem. The thalamus sits on top of the brainstem. And again, if we go to thalamic cross section, right, you'll see that here's the thalamus and here's the brainstem. Okay, well, that's a lot for today. I just wanted to see if I could compress this to around 10 minutes or so. Obviously, you can't talk too much about all the different pieces of the pathways and the neural tissue of the brain and the subcortical structures, which the basal ganglia are, in 10 minutes, but I needed to organize my thoughts, and I will jump to a new topic tomorrow. Okay, see you around.